Sets yet another single-day record for new coronavirus cases. The U-shaped or even V-shaped recovery that some have predicted is looking less and less likely. Joining me now to help us break down what this all means for the economy is Erik Nelson, macro strategist at Wells Fargo Securities. Erik, great to have you with me here today. As Brad had just mentioned, we're seeing states who are putting a pause on their reopening, states, though, reluctant to go to a fully locked down mode. But what does this kind of uncertainty around what states are doing individually, what does that do to investor sentiment overall?
Yeah, I think Brad hit on this, which is a really important point, that these are some of the biggest states in the country, both by population and GDP. And I think naturally the fear is that, okay, we're seeing this in some of these large states, and now are we going to see this in other states going forward? In fact, we already are in the Arizonas, Arkansas, other states like that. And it's a question of, okay, we're seeing some of the worst numbers in terms of hospitalizations and sort of cases overall right now. And as that continues to get worse, will these states become more and more stringent with rolling back reopening plans or moving back toward either lockdowns or something looking like lockdowns? And that concern is really what's weighing heavily on the market here.
Yeah, and it feels like that concern will remain until a vaccine is widely available. We've heard that from plenty of experts, but we also heard from Dr. Fauci that a vaccine likely won't be available until 2021 at the earliest. What do you think investors will be doing? What will the economy kind of look like until we do have a vaccine available en masse?
I think so much depends on policymakers and specifically on Washington and what Congress does at this point. If we think back to March, Congress effectively built a bridge for the economy to get to this point. It offered up stimulus checks and expanded unemployment for individuals, small business relief, and a lot of measures for some of the larger businesses as well. And we're getting to the point now where some of these sort of bridge-like measures are reaching an end or coming to an end. I'm thinking in particular about expanded unemployment set to expire at the end of July. And so much hinges now on whether Congress decides to extend these bridges and sort of keep the economy afloat while we all have sort of a cautious approach toward our daily lives. And the question now is, will that partisanship and deficit concern start to creep in and prevent the stimulus that's needed from being passed? And that's, I think, one of the biggest concerns for markets right now.
Well, speaking of stimulus, we've seen unprecedented measures from the Federal Reserve, these backstops that seemingly have come out of thin air in some cases. Do you think this has kind of fundamentally changed the way investors think about economic crises where it feels like there are backstops, or are they concerned that, to your point, there might not be agreement or we might actually run out of tools to provide that kind of stimulus, whether it's monetary or fiscal?
Yeah, I think it's very important to distinguish between monetary and fiscal, because on the monetary side, you have things that can be deployed very quickly. I'm thinking about the Fed opening up swap lines with other central banks, opening up repo facility and giving banks some relief. All these things that can be really implemented very quickly and provide immediate relief. The fiscal measures just take longer and are a little more complicated. Think about some of the problems with the rollout of the PPP, some of the larger businesses that got that. And I think in terms of the longer term economic implications, I would put more weight on the fiscal measures than the Fed's monetary measures. Not to say the Fed's measures don't matter, but fiscal to me is much more important. But even on that score, let's think about where we are now versus where we were back in, say, 1929, ahead of the Great Depression. There was no FDIC, right? People lost their entire life savings overnight, and we're just not at a point where that's the kind of thing that people are worried about. So I think we've come a long way on the fiscal side, and that to me is very positive for both investors and for the economy.
So basically investors should and are reacting more to potential measures by the government versus, say, the Fed. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Well, not necessarily. I think the immediate reaction is to more of the Fed, right? Because that's what we can see sort of deployed quickly, and it's much more, I think, markets have sort of tied themselves to the Fed action in terms of the short-term moves. But as we think 6 to 12 months out and how Main Street is going to fare as this crisis unfolds, I personally think that much more will depend on what fiscal policymakers do. Can they keep people in their jobs? Can they keep the money flowing into the households, that's going to be more important to me than what the stock market does or whether corporate credit spreads are, at a certain level. The fiscal policy, I think, to me, is number one on that front.
Yeah, that makes sense. We're also seeing some retailers close after having reopened some of their stores, like Apple, for example. What does this kind of do to investors' optimism in businesses reopening when we see some of these big players that have kind of taken a step before other retailers, other stores in reopening, and now have had to kind of backtrack and shut their doors yet again?
Yeah, I think it's very symbolic, right, of what's in store for the economy, because for every Apple store closure you see or Microsoft store closure you see, there's probably 10 or 20 small businesses that are closing. I mean, look at Texas, for example, where bars have been forced to close. So I think it's just indicative of this idea that we're kind of going in fits and starts here as we try to get back to some level of normalcy in the economy.
All right, Erik, thank you so much for your time and for your insight today. That's Erik Nelson, macro strategist at Wells Fargo Securities.